When people look at SERBAN, they see many different things. I can only tell you what I see. I see somebody who started out in an analog environment where the pressure was on. So we're talking about somebody who had to deliver mixes, basically be scrutinized by their peers, be under the gun, very high pressure situations. And that's how they formed their ability to make great music. It wasn't the way a lot of us do, which is no pressure situations, working on our own stuff. It was a very different environment than so many of us are familiar with. On top of which, we all know he mixes completely in the box now. And that's what a lot of people will tell you when they try to tell you that, analog gear doesn't make a difference. Guys, the top mixers now are mixing in the box. A lot of them are. A lot of them also aren't. There's a split there where some people work hybrid, some people mix in the box, and there's more mixing in the box all the time, definitely. Every year, a few more, I'd say, go that way. But I think there's a big misconception between people who started and only have ever mixed in the box, and then people who wind up doing that as a result of, you know, times changing and them wanting an easier workflow, them wanting the ability to recall things quickly. So there's a reason guys go digital, but it's a big difference to have started analog, because if you've at one time worked analog, you sort of have an idea of what things sound like when they're at their best. So that's a concept I think people neglect. When you're recording in the analog world, you spend so much time getting sounds and making things sound great before you record, because if you were brought up in the analog space, that's all you had. You had to make it sound great because fix it later wasn't your thought process. It just wasn't part of the way you thought. Whereas today, it's always, let's record as clean as possible, and that way we have as many options later to do more. That's the thought process. It's, we could try 100 things later, so let's do it then. Let's just record a DI and add the guitar tone later, and we could let's just, we don't need nothing. We'll change the drums out with samples. I mean, we could click pots and pans. I mean, this is a totally different thought process, and it's always we're one undo away from changing things. So coming from a thought process of analog like SERBAN did, allows him to think completely differently, but it also gives him that frame of reference of what is good. Knowing what good is allows him to get to good when he's mixing digitally. Now, if you were to put the spotlight on yourself, you shine that thing on you, and you, for a minute, say to yourself, it's not because of the material I'm working on that doesn't sound good that it's hard for me to get good mixes. We all know if you have a better source, your ability to get a better mix is easier. It's just a fact. When you pull things up that sound better, it's easier to get better mixes. But the reason SERBAN's in such a great position to work on stuff that sounds at the highest quality level, that it's recorded the best in the best studios with the best producers, and that's the stuff he's working on, the reason is because he worked as hard as he did and was able to produce consistent enough results for as long as he has, that he always made people happy, blew them out of the water with his mixes, where he just got all the gigs, and then he got to this position where everything he gets to work on sounds amazing for the most part. And I'm sure he does some stuff that doesn't, but he gets a lot of great stuff. A lot of stuff a lot of us would love to be able to work on, if for no other reason than just to have tracks that start in such an amazing position, where so much pain and time was taken to get them to be recorded that way, to sound as good as they did. Like every track he pulls up that was recorded by a guy who was at least from the analog world, or even if not, a guy who's confident enough to commit his sounds, to know what he's going for, to really make a record sound like something and not nothing. Anytime you pull up stuff like that, it's always more fun to mix. So when you look at it like his job is easier because he gets this great stuff and, that's why his mixes sound great. No. He has the ability to work on that because of how great his mixes sounded on everything he worked on for people, that they kept hiring him, that the word of mouth spread, that he got where he got. That's why he's working on the best stuff. So let's ignore that for a second, all right? Coming from a place of not knowing what sounds good is you shining the spotlight on yourself and saying, maybe I'm the problem. And if you look at it that way, at least, now you can all of a sudden get better. The other way doesn't help you in the least. It's not going to make you a better mixer. It's not going to make you a better producer, a better engineer. If you say it's not my fault, it's the fault on the stuff I'm getting. It's the tracks I get. It's the fact that I have a bad interface. It's whatever. Like if you blame the stuff, the tools, you will never get better ever. Okay? So if you've put the focus on you, what could it be? Now maybe it's not your ears. In other words, maybe your ears are great. Maybe your ears are special and you can hear amazingly well and you have taste, so you know what you want things to sound like, but you don't have necessarily the experience to know how good something can sound. Now that is a big differentiator, huge differentiator. If you at one time worked in a studio with gear that was great, when I interned, I heard what a good drum sound is. I heard what it was like to stand in a control room and hear the drums sound amazing. And I said to myself, that's what a good snare sound is. That's what a good kick sound is. Now, granted, there's a lot of decisions taste-wise that go into the sounds, but before it was mixed, to be able to say this sounds great, it gives you sort of a frame of reference in some way of, okay, that's what I'm aiming for when I'm taking a song where maybe the kick drum doesn't sound good. I'm aiming for the clarity that I hear on all the instruments. I'm aiming for, things to sort of not smush and blur together. I'm aiming for the tom, for example, to not, sound like it's got all this muddy mid-range, to just be clear and powerful and have that much low end compared to the kick, compared to the snare. You sort of get an idea of what does a good room sound like for drums when you hear drums recorded in a good room. If you just have only heard drums in a very dead, like bedroom space, for example, then you go into a great studio and hear drums in a big live room, you'll be blown away by just the difference of the raw sounds that you would get. It's completely different. I'm not saying really one is better than the other, but having a frame of reference of, wow, that's what live drums sound like. Really good drums in a great sounding room. That's what they sound like. Now, you could always make that more dead. You could always wheel gobos in and deaden the room up. And now all of a sudden, it sounds like a dead room. But without having the frame of reference, some people will go about it by try to put processing on things to then make them sound live. And, I forget who said this exactly. It might have been, I've been just listening to so much Greg Wells lately and so much Steve Albini stuff that it's one of them most likely. But it might have been Steve. It sounds like something Steve would say, where he basically that when you put digital reverb, even great sounding reverbs on any source, what's basically happening is it's that one source at one point is being simulated through this reverb, this virtual sound. It's very, very different than that source having all these points of banking off the walls within the room and how far the tom is from the snare and just the distance there. There's so many different differentiators and overtones based on physical space that just don't exist when everything is being, what's the right word for that? I want to say when everything is being, it's enunciated, but that's not the right word because we're not talking about speech. It's everything is exuding from this one position of that's where the tom is, that's where the snare is. Everything has the same distance to the everything. And as a result, you don't get the same sense of space. So when I think about stuff like this, I think, having the ability to know what drums sound like in a real room makes it where you won't be satisfied with your digital reverb sounds that you're dialing up. It just won't sound the same to you. As a result, you're going to make other choices that don't sound as fake. Even great sounding reverbs today that, do a lot. if you know what good is, you'll know what not good is my point. And if you are compressing something and you know what it sounds like to have a drum sound great without the compression, you won't be leaning into your compression as much because you'll know it's not going to sound better to compress this to hell. It's going to sound worse. I should be able to get more out of this without doing that. So knowing what good is sets your reference point in the right place. And I think that's really the thing people are missing is all these guys who mix in the box come from a background of analog. The ones that do it really well, they're not young guys. Most of the mixers, everybody should realize this. If you're expecting to learn how to mix real quick and watch a bunch of shorts and figure it out, you're in for a rude awakening. What we do is not a young man's game. All the guys who mix at the top level are old timers. We're talking 60s, most of them, okay? Some of them are older, and then you get some 50s. Very few 40s, even less 30s is the point. 20s, almost non-existent. Now, why is that the case? I'm not saying that some people don't exist and some people are going to name a couple people. Great, you named a couple people. The majority are not. And the reason they're not is because what we do requires a huge breadth of knowledge. That's why when people talk and give you, and they spend the time making a 20-minute video or something, the goal is to tell you so much that you can pick up the little things. Those things that we're saying, you can't just be like, this is how you do it. It's this 1 minute. Now go and have fun. There you go. It's not that kind of business. It's a business that requires so much of a breadth of knowledge that you can then use the parts you need to find out on certain things to then discover other things. It's a discovery business. You're discovering every step of the way, and nothing you're working on is going to be the same as whoever did whatever. So any sort of one-fit-all trick doesn't exist. So as a result, you get stories. You get what worked for some people. You get idea-based thinking. That all must come out in long form. There's really no way to do this in short form without really missing the whole bulk of it. So I'm not saying guys don't do it, but they do it to kind of whet your appetite and to push their own algorithm, so that their channel goes somewhere further because they know some people ain't got the attention span. But those people are lost in the kiddie park at Disneyland. The ones that think they could just go through that and learn anything. You need the stories because the things in between the points is what's going to teach you more than telling you to do anything. So when I think about this, I think there's a benefit for anyone to at some point use some sort of analog gear or at least stand over the shoulder of somebody who's using analog gear if they'll let you, do something like that just to be able to get some of that under your belt of what things sound like. Because without that, with just going in digital only, you are at such a disadvantage compared to the guys who know what they're aiming for, who know what good is, because you don't. And as a result, you're just like shooting in the dark using tools that you're hoping do something, and you may never really know how much better it could be. So I am not saying that you need to mix analog or digital can't do it. I'm saying that the guys who mix digital and do it so well, it's not because they didn't try analog and didn't use it for years. It's because they probably did. It's because they were in environments where the pressure was so high that they had to fail. They were forced to fail constantly. Now, knowing all this stuff, forced to fail means, you're put under the gun. Did you drop the ball or not? Steve Albini talks about that, where when he recorded Fugazi, he dropped the ball the first time because he was having too much fun, because he liked what he was doing with the people he was doing it with too much. And as a result, he didn't put as much focus as he should on doing his job, which would have been recording everything to the best of his ability and making sure the takes were right, not that everyone was having fun in that same way. So, he changed his whole outlook from dropping the ball. And that's what a lot of guys are sort of forced into when the pressure's on. So, that's a big reason why the quicker you could start mixing things for other people, if that's your goal, the better. There's no one way to figure out how to get people to work with you, but the quicker you could do that, the better, because failing is helpful and it will make you get way further. It'll make you learn way more. You must go through that. And that's also why releasing stuff constantly and not caring what anybody thinks is a great thing, because you will decide whether you like what you did or not later. But if you never release it, you actually never make that decision on whether you liked what you did or not. You can't just make it in your own private nothing with no force of, let's do this. You got to be forced to actually put stuff out to then be able to really reflect on what you did and really understand if you could do better or not. Otherwise, you never release it, so you never really put yourself on the line. You'll just tweak forever. So if we go back to one major point here, guys like Steve Albini, were in a position where they hated doing things twice. Steve Albini talks about many times how he was kind of lazy as a person. Even though he worked as hard as he did, that drove his laziness to work harder so he could take a day off, to get things right at the source so that later he wouldn't have to do it again. So he'd get it right once, then mixing would be easier. He'd mix as he went so he wouldn't have to make 1,000 decisions on the last week of the process. He would do it as he went. It would be sounding great immediately when they recorded, so he wouldn't have to worry about how am I going to get this to sound great on the last day of that song or whatever that they were working on. So everything about his personality was one that tried to do it right the first time, so he wouldn't have to do it a second time. Now, also, what comes along with this in my mind is when you're competing with a guy who is mixing all in the box, who can make 1 million tweaks, you should realize that that's his thing. Because he's mixing digital, he can make 1 million tweaks. It might be better if you don't look at it like you are going to need to make 1 million tweaks. And that's why I love the idea of mixing in a way where you can't really recall it. I love that because it puts so much more pressure on being good in the moment. And this thing's got to work, and it's not about tweaking it 100 times. Because I'd venture to say the guys who want to work with you, if you are special enough, they're going to work with you. If you're not special enough, they're going to find somebody else to work on their stuff. It's not going to have anything to do with whether your mix was good enough, but you can't tweak the vocal up 1 dB so they don't want to work with you. I think it's way more big picture than that. So I don't think your ability to make tweaks is going to actually stop anyone from working with you if your mixes are special enough. A guy like SERBAN can make as many tweaks as he has to, and for major labels, he might have to. And they might want it to be exactly the same, but with 1 tweak made, and that works for him. But in my opinion, you shouldn't be trying to be SERBAN. You should be trying to be a very, very special mixer who is completely unique to you. Someone else who delivers their sound. And if part of your sound, your style, and the way you work is there ain't no tweaks, I'll make you another mix. Compare it to the one I did already because nothing is recallable. If you decided to work like that, I'm telling you, if your mixes are good enough, nobody will care. It will be fine with them. So this really comes down to how you like to work and how you want to work, because you can work any way you want. You don't need to be working in the way that you think a major label is going to work with you if this. Another thing Steve Albini said that I loved, he's like, 6 records I've worked on became big records. Every other record was just either, pretty good, and like in terms of what it did, or completely something that nobody ever heard of. To the point where very few people heard of it, just an immediate following of a small number. So outside of like 6 major hit records that he did, most of them were the never heards or only heard by a handful, the following, whoever the following was. Maybe it's 5,000, 6,000, 10,000, whatever, but a small number, let's say, or less is the bulk of it. Some that did pretty good, and 6 that were major big records. So when you think about that, why would you make yourself structured in a way where the 6 were for 6 records from a guy who had a breadth of records of I don't know, it was probably over 2,000 that he had worked on, for sure. So what I'm saying is, why would you make yourself like, for those, if I ever do, get big, I want the record label to be able to make 100 tweaks. Don't position yourself that way. Position yourself as somebody who can make a mix that sounds so good that they will hire you no matter what you're doing with revisions. Even if you tell them, I'm not the revision guy. You want revisions like crazy? Go somewhere else. That ain't me. I think they'll hire you anyway if your mix is special enough. It will also force them to look at the whole thing different, where they'll be like, okay, your first mix is better than your second. I love so many things about that, so let's just go with that. You may start a whole new movement, and what I'm saying is you kind of need that to be a guy who achieves success on the level of SERBAN, because the SERBAN digital all in the box, as many recalls and tweaks as you want, that thing's kind of been done. It's being done by all these guys who have that whole breadth of knowledge that most of us will never, ever have. Those years in the analog studio world, the more years that pass from that time, the less of us are going to have that ability. So since so many of us don't, I think we should all come at this thing completely different. And for the couple projects where you need to do, a bunch of crazy versions and prints and this and stem out everything for those times where that's what has to be done. So you'll make an exception to work differently for those times. But the rest of the time, work how you want to work, however that is. And don't be forced to thinking you got to do this because that's the norm. Forget the norm. Nobody who tries to be within the norm, in my opinion, is going to be as successful as they should be. Be your own norm. Create your own way to do this thing. And that's my favorite part about analog, is that who cares where the knobs are set? That's what felt right this time. And what we do is alive. So get used to it, because there ain't no tweaks over here. I love that. Now, I'm not quite there yet where I'm going to say that, because at the moment, I'm actually still mixing in the box. But man, do I want to say that. Wow, do I want to be that and live that. So I might, because if I have to worry about making all the prints, like I said, for whatever, I'll figure it out at that point. Until then, my only goal is to make things that sound as special as possible. So somebody has to use me, and making their vocal 1 dB louder in the last chorus ain't going to make or break that. Because sometimes, like my last video, that rough is special. That initial creation is special. Recreating it only makes it worse. And there's no difference tweaking your mix 3 or 4 or 10 times. No different. That's recreating and recreating and recreating. It's never as special as the first time you performed it, the initial creation. So there might be some logic here. Don't try to be SERBAN, doing what he can do, even in his workflow. Why? It's not going to help you, because you're not him and you don't have his history of where he started and his reference point of what is good. You don't have any of that. So create your own workflow, your own style. Make the stuff you do sound so crazy weird that some people will love it and have to work with you. That's, in my opinion, what your goal should be. So I'm sure you guys have your own opinions on this. I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment, answers, questions, throw it in there. Like, subscribe, Evan Jaffe Custom Cut Studios. You guys got this. Take it easy.